2,300 organizations named on extortion leak sites in a single quarter, 51% higher than this time last year. And it's not slowing down, it's becoming the new baseline. And really underneath those numbers, a new group has industrialized the affiliate model to claim the top spot. A long silent operation just surfaced with a command and control channel that lives on the blockchain. And Clop turned a single vulnerability in an enterprise application into a data theft and extortion machine. Well, today we're breaking down exactly how it happened and what you can do about it.
Welcome to ShadowTalk, a cybersecurity podcast powered by ReliaQuest, the leader in agentic AI security operations. I'm Brandon Tirado, Vice President of GreyMatter Operations.
And I'm John Dilgen, Threat Intelligence Analyst. And today, our episode is focused on the ransomware and extortion landscape and really how it evolved in the last quarter in 2026. Now, we'll cover insights taken directly from our latest report, ransomware and cyber extortion in Q2 of 2026.
And there's a lot to unpack there. You know, in the last few months, ransomware and extortion groups named roughly 2,300 organizations on their leak sites. That was down 15% from quarter one, but still approximately 51% higher than the same quarter last year.
Yeah, and one important caveat around those numbers is those are just threat actor claims, right? What essentially they are is organizations being named on leak sites, and that does not automatically mean every compromise has been independently confirmed.
Right. But even with that caveat, the data still gives us a pretty clear picture of activity, targeting, and changes within the ransomware ecosystem as a whole.
Yeah, exactly. And really, the leaderboard was shaken up and changed substantially last quarter. The gentleman moved into the first place, while previous leaders like Quillen, Dragonforce, and Coinbase Cartel lost ground. And Deadlock emerged from nearly a year of public silence with techniques that could undermine two controls many organizations heavily rely on: network block lists and endpoint detection and response, or EDR.
And also, John, don't forget about Clop, right? This group is, highly likely exploiting a critical vulnerability in PTC Windchill and deploying custom web shells.
Yeah, it's a good call out. That's an emerging story with a lot more to come in the next few weeks. Either way, today we're breaking down these three main stories. First, how the gentleman industrialized the affiliate model and climbed to the top of the rankings. Second, why Deadlock may be more important than its leaderboard position suggests. And third, how Clop's application-specific approach turns a single vulnerable server into a potential enterprise-wide identity and data compromise. And then finally, we'll tie it all together with what organizations should do about all of it.
Awesome. All right, John, let's jump into it. So why don't we kick us off with the overall picture of quarter two? What has changed in the ransomware ecosystem? And on the flip side, what has stayed the same?
Yeah, so let's break down those key stats. So the number one headline is that the ransomware leaderboard changed. Really, the key factors, though, driving their success are still the same. And the two I'll call out are going to be the affiliate recruitment, right? Who can attract the most affiliates to their brand, and who provides the most advanced tools to their affiliates. Both of those help drive a group's success. Across Q2 of 2026, ransomware and extortion groups named roughly 2,300 organizations in total. That was a quarter-over-quarter decline, but a year-over-year increase. And it really shows that attacks overall are increasing, which is something we've seen in the past few quarters. Now, we tracked activity across 90 different extortion groups in total, and they posted organizations from 99 different victim countries. This is probably no surprise to you listening, but the United States remained the dominant target, accounting for roughly 1,100 of the victims posted, or 49% of the overall activity observed in Q2.
And John, which sectors did we find experiencing the most pressure here?
Yeah, so again, likely no surprise for you listening, but professional, scientific, and technical services led for the fifth consecutive quarter. Among the top 11 groups, that sector accounted for roughly 440 posts. Now, manufacturing and construction organizations were also heavily targeted.
Yeah. So, John, like, there's obviously a trend there. Professional services. What's going on? Why are they so consistently attractive for the ransomware affiliates?
Yeah, it's a good question, Brendan. And really, it comes down to high value data that they hold and that data allows for potential downstream leverage, right? Often these professional service firms hold confidential information for dozens or hundreds of customers, which, as we've seen in quite a few high profile attacks in 2026, helps extend the blast radius to the third parties connected to that organization. So the compromised organization likely already has trusted access to client systems, shared document repositories, identity platforms, or administrative tools. So, really, by compromising one firm here, attackers can create multiple extortion opportunities. And they may obtain the firm's own data, its customers' data, and potentially a route into those downstream environments.
So and that third party exposure, what you're saying is it's not stopping at the sector. It's essentially this is how it shows up in the geographic data, correct?
Yeah, it shows up there too. And that's a really important point. I said that the United States leading is no surprise here, but the geography of who's being targeted also shows a proxy for supply chain exposure. So I mentioned the United States leads in victim counts, but elevated activity in countries like India and Thailand shows potential signals to things like outsourced IT, software development, and manufacturing relationships that tend to concentrate in those countries. And just like we were talking about with the sector targeting, an attacker doesn't need to target your headquarters directly if they can reach your environment through a trusted third party that's operating in those regions.
Awesome. All right, John, let's talk about the new number one group, right? The gentleman took this spot, but let's start off with who are the gentlemen and really what's driven their rise here.
Yeah, so the gentlemen right now are the number one as far as organizations named ransomware as a service group, and they named roughly 300 organizations during Q2, narrowly surpassing Quillen, who named roughly 290. The gentlemen closed the quarter with their most active month and posted roughly 120 organizations to their league site in June.
Yeah, and John, when I was digging into this with the team, they had mentioned that this wasn't necessarily a sudden appearance out of nowhere, right? There's something greater that's been stewing.
Yeah, exactly. We've been tracking the gentlemen since back into 2025 here, and really their movement, or I should say their momentum, was already visible in Q1, right? And this is when their league site volume increased by over 580% quarter over quarter. And their numbers in Q2, they really suggest that the affiliate program continued to recruit successfully and increase its operational output by advancing its capabilities.
Yeah, so John, like that affiliate model, I want to dive deeper into because like the affiliates are essentially what are driving these ransomware as a service organizations. So what is making their affiliate model stand out or is being perceived as so different?
Yeah, there's one big thing, and that's packaging, or really the advanced tool package that they offer to their affiliates, right? So, according to leaked communications that came out from the gentleman that were analyzed by our team, affiliates receive a pre assembled intrusion kit rather than having to build an operation from scratch. And that kit includes pre compromised targets of who to attack and custom tools for a wide variety of functions, including disabling EDR, domain wide ransomware execution, exfiltration, edge device exploitation, and lightweight command and control tunneling.
So essentially, what they're doing is providing this kit, which is helping the affiliates and lowering the barrier to entry for said affiliates. Is that right?
Yeah, it really lowers it significantly. And you at home can think of this like the difference between a franchise organization and a startup, right? A standalone attacker has to build, test, fail, and rebuild from the ground up. Whereas an affiliate with the gentleman's kit can deploy immediately, learn quickly from what didn't work, and iterate fast because the core components are already proven. And really, that cycle of deploy, observe, refine, and repeat is what separates high volume operators from one off attacks.
And John, I'm pretty certain, right? In our report, we also discuss that there's reason to believe that there's some AI augmentation or assisted development that the gentlemen are using.
Yeah, exactly. The leaked communications that I mentioned, they indicate the group is likely using AI to accelerate the development and updating of the affiliate tools. And we should, clarify what this means. It's likely that AI is helping human operators iterate through that development cycle faster. They can write, modify, troubleshoot, and package tools with greater speed.
Yeah. So the effect in short is just, shorter development cycles.
Yeah, exactly. And it really reminds me here, or it's very similar to what legitimate companies are doing right now, right? Speeding up and sharpening their development life cycles with the use of AI. And that also links back to the episode where we recently talked to author Jeff White. And, he had some really interesting insights into how these extortion groups think of themselves. And they don't think of themselves like attackers. They think of themselves like your business competitor here, right? So if you haven't listened to that episode already, I highly recommend you go back and listen to our episode with Jeff White, where we broke down his findings on Conti and how these groups operate. Now, taking it back to the current episode, right? What we're really discussing here is exactly the business competitor mindset that Jeff was describing. For example, if developers can update an EDR killer, modify deployment scripts, or adapt a tunneling tool in days instead of weeks or months, then the affiliate program becomes more responsive and competitive. And that matters because ransomware affiliates are very mobile. They tend to move toward the program or the ransomware groups offering the best combination of profitability, support, tooling, and operational reliability.
All right, John. So we spoke through the gentlemen. Obviously, they're claiming that number one spot, but I feel that naturally, brings us to the groups that have lost ground, right? So Quillen, they had led the rankings for 4 consecutive quarters, but things have seemed to shift. So what happened here with Quillen in quarter 2?
Yeah, so Quillen still had a strong quarter, right? They remained active and they finished a close second, but their monthly volume declined roughly 29%. And one likely explanation behind that is affiliate migration, right? The gentleman's leadership has reportedly had a history of working for Quillen, right? And they made their group specifically to improve on Quillen's processes. So a lot of the volume decline is likely to be affiliates moving to the better resourced and more attractive ransomware program.
Yeah. So John, like not only the gentleman, right? They offered these kits, but wasn't there something about the competitive split between the affiliates and the actual ransomware as a service creators? Something like traditionally 80-20 offered by many other ransomware groups, but in this case the gentleman offering a 90-10 split. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's another big factor into the group attracting affiliates and the group's success. Now, in the other part of the landscape, other big names like Dragon Force declined, also likely due to affiliate movement with a 58% decrease in volume. And Coinbase Cartel had one of the biggest reductions at 91%.
And that's interesting, but John, the main takeaway from these declines is not that you shouldn't worry about these groups anymore. They could all resurface. What we're really doing here is helping outline these numbers to show which of these ransomware as a service models are currently the most successful and to help further demonstrate which factors are driving their success. Which now leads us to Deadlock. We've been teasing this a little bit already. This is a good example of, why a leaderboard can't tell a whole story. So John, why don't you break that down for us?
Yes, certainly. So Deadlock has been active from at least July of 2025, but it remained absent from public leak sites for approximately 11 months. Then in June 2026, the group publicly named 75 organizations in a single month.
Yeah, and that's pretty significant amount of activity for a group, that has been more or less publicly quiet, right?
Yeah, it really is. And it's a possible sign that they will become a strong contender here, right? If I remember correctly, the gentleman named over 30 organizations in their first month, which was a very strong indication for the group back then. And now they're at the top. But Deadlock's techniques are even more notable than its volume. Just like the gentleman as well, Deadlock is arriving with advanced tactics too. For example, it has been storing its C2 or its command and control instructions inside a public blockchain to help avoid detections. Instead of hard coding a C2 domain or proxy IP address into the malware itself, Deadlock queries a smart contract on the Polygon blockchain, and that contract stores the current proxy address or the next step in the communication. If the operator wants to change infrastructure, it sends a transaction updating the smart contract, and the malware reads the new address during its next check-in.
So yeah, so I hear that as a defender, right? Obviously we can block the current address, but really what the system that they set up, the attacker is in favor here because now they can replace, what is being pointed to by not having to necessarily update the malware, but the blockchain in this case.
Yeah, exactly. And there's no conventional registrar or hosting provider that can simply suspend the smart contract, right? The blockchain itself is public and decentralized. Another a factor helping to make this malware and command and control structure more resilient. The attacker still needs a proxy infrastructure outside the blockchain. And those proxies, as you mentioned, can potentially be identified and blocked. But the blockchain gives the malware a resilient way to discover whichever proxy the operators wanted to use next.
And the second major capability, Deadlock is bringing is impacting EDR, right, John?
Yeah, it really is. And this is very important to understand if you're listening, right? Because it's another key factor that is driving the success of the gentleman and also parallels here in Deadlock, right? So the top groups use and provide methods to bypass EDR detections or disable the EDR entirely. Deadlock has a similar strategy. It uses a bring your own vulnerable driver technique, also known as BYOVD, to terminate endpoint security products at the kernel level. A loader drops a legitimate but vulnerable signed antivirus driver, and that driver is affected by an improper privilege management vulnerability. Once loaded, though, it can allow protected security processes to be terminated.
Yeah. So essentially, in short, meaning an EDR may go dark immediately before when you would need it most, which would be at encryption time.
Exactly. And that creates a dangerous detection gap, right? A security team may see an endpoint stop reporting and assume that it's a connectivity issue or an agent health issue. Whereas in reality, an attacker may have deliberately removed the telemetry before moving into the destructive phase.
Awesome, John. Let's move to Clop now, right? What's going on here with Clop? Give us some background.
Yeah, so Clop is a financially motivated extortion group known for mass exploiting enterprise software vulnerabilities. The group often appears quiet between campaigns. We haven't seen them in a little while, but when the group identifies a high value vulnerability, it can scale extortion rapidly. In the last few months, Clop has highly likely been exploiting a critical remote code execution vulnerability in PTC Windchill, known as CVE 2026 12569, and they then deploy a custom web shell with a full suite of attack capabilities.
Yeah, and worth calling out, that web shell isn't off the shelf, right? It's purpose built for Windchill, which means Clop's invested real development time against the platform before the first victim was ever really touched. So, John, what is Windchill and why has it been such an attractive target here?
Yeah, so PTC Windchill is a product lifecycle management platform used extensively in manufacturing and engineering environments. It can hold product designs, engineering documents, intellectual property, administrative credentials, and connections to other enterprise services. And really, that means a successful compromise can give an attacker both valuable data that can be used in extortion and credentials that may unlock additional systems and access on the network. All right, so that's kind of everything. Brendan, let's take a step back. We covered the three different main groups in Q2: the gentleman, the resilient Deadlock, and Clop. But what do those listening need to understand about them?
Yeah, and John, we keep coming back to this one. Obviously, if you're a listener, an active listener of Shadow Talk, this will not come at any surprise. But really, it's the speed here. You know, every one of these groups has engineered in some way or another. The slow part of an intrusion, right? The gentleman, as an example, is shipping affiliates a workflow, or Deadlock is automating the EDR kill. Also with Clop, their implant is doing credential access and data discovery in essentially one shot. So that the skill used to be the bottleneck, but it's not anymore. And that changes what defenders are actually seeing, right? The old intrusion, left trails, dozens of commands, tools staged on disk, a noisy discovery phase. Now, if you collapse all of that into one implant, that trail is mostly disappearing.
Yeah, so really to restate what you said, Brandon, there's kind of a twofold problem here for defenders. Not only do they have less time to respond, but also there is less activity to detect on.
Yeah, and if triage is depending on a human analyst manually reviewing these disconnected alerts, the attacker will likely be exfiltrating data or preparing for encryption before the security team is even understanding of these events are related or not.
Yeah, good point. So on top of that, defenders also have a visibility problem. How is that unfolding?
Yeah, so Deadlock can obviously, as we discussed, terminate EDR at the kernel level, but Clop is able to and has shown their ability to run queries through an application's trusted database identity and execute additional code inside the application process itself. But both approaches limit telemetry used by very common detections. Security teams are often heavily relying on endpoint telemetry for command execution and file monitoring, or say network-based detections to stop C2 communications. However, the best extortion groups keep finding new ways to bypass these.
Yeah, and that's really what keeps driving them to the top of the leaderboards and makes them successful. All right, so the final challenge here is third-party risk. Brandon, can you walk the listeners through that?
Yeah, so professional service providers, manufacturers, and outsource IT companies frequently hold data or trusted access for many customers. A compromise can create a much larger blast radius than the victim organization alone. So critical vendors, absolutely belong on your ransomware attack surface, not just in a procurement questionnaire, right? If a vendor's compromise would put your data or your identity environment at risk, you should be able to answer, before it happens, what your detection and containment looks like for that scenario.
Yeah, great point. All right, so to recap the three major things we're calling out, right? These operations, as far as the ransomware operators go, are built for speed and automation, compressing the time defenders have to respond while generating less activity to detect. Visibility is increasingly being stripped away, whether through disabling endpoint tools or implants that blend into trusted application behavior. And third parties can dramatically expand the blast radius of a single compromise.
All right, John. So we listed off a set of pretty difficult problems, right? But there are definitely some practical controls that organizations can prioritize and should. So let's get into those right after this quick break.
Shadow Talk is brought to you by ReliaQuest, the global leader in AI cybersecurity. ReliaQuest helps enterprise cybersecurity teams contain threats in minutes with its agentic AI security operations platform, GreyMatter. ReliaQuest makes security possible for the most trusted enterprise brands in the world. Learn more at ReliaQuest.com.
All right, we're back. So, John, we were just talking through a lot of these problems, but let's talk through some solutions here. So, first and foremost, let's address the EDR killing capabilities that a lot of these ransomware groups that we've discussed are coming with. What would you say that organizations can do when it comes to these vulnerable drivers that are kind of fueling this phenomenon?
Yeah, there's some pretty solid recommendations here. So I'd say enforce Microsoft's vulnerable driver block list using Windows Defender application control and hypervisor protected code integrity, also known as HVCI. Now, the important word here is to enforce, right? Some organizations deploy these policies in audit mode and never complete the full transition, right? Whereas others have server exclusions or hardware that does not support virtualization based security or exceptions for legacy drivers. Now, while these are sometimes needed in an enterprise environment, it's really important that you understand the gaps and risks created by these exceptions in attack chains.
Yeah, and John, this is where I really want to double down here, right? And just emphasize that, enforce is where this quietly all falls apart, right? I have never seen an organization that didn't have exceptions, right? The question really becomes whether anyone still knows what they are. Audit mode policies from a rollout 2 years ago is not going to stop a vulnerable driver today.
Yeah, exactly. And so, really, the key thing here for listeners is you need to audit for known vulnerable drivers, legacy sign modules, excluded servers, per host exceptions, and unsupported systems. Then from there, you can look for unknown driver activity, followed by suspicious downstream behaviors. An unexpected driver, for example, executing, followed by EDR termination or configuration changes.
And yeah, and John, another big gap is the unknown hosts that never get EDR installed, or even the hosts where EDR protection quietly falls off due to software updates or other random everyday events. In those cases, the attackers already get a step ahead. So it's so critical for organizations to regularly audit for complete EDR coverage. Ideally, with an automated tool that can quickly alert, your team for a quick remediation.
Yeah, and just to cut in there real quick, Brandon, another good important point for those listening is complete EDR coverage is also a discount on your ransomware insurance. So just another reason to do it. It's saving you money.
Awesome. And so, John, let's switch gears here, talking a little bit about the approach that Deadlock has been utilizing with some blockchain-based C2. So, why don't you walk us through what can organizations do to help defend against this new tactic?
Yeah, so at a high level, it's very similar to how we're implementing other defenses. Audit to understand what's normal in your environment, and then from there you can layer in controls to ensure you're not blocking off legitimate services. So I'd say for you listening, start by identifying systems that legitimately interact with public blockchain infrastructure. A developer workstation or a approved blockchain application may have a valid reason to contact something like a Polygon remote procedure call or an RPC service, which is a gateway or communication endpoint that lets wallets, decentralized apps, and code talk to the Polygon blockchain. However, a domain controller, a file server, or an employee workstation in a non development department usually don't have any need to communicate this way. So, monitor for outbound connections from servers and non developer endpoints to Polygon RPC providers and public nodes. This includes services such as Infura, Alchemy, and QuickNode.
Yeah, but again, just to make sure our listeners hear it right? Blockchain traffic alone is not a tale necessarily of ransomware definitively.
Yeah, great point to call out there. Context matters here, right? But really, this is a signal that should quickly kick off investigations on that host, right? Your playbooks should have quick searches ready to identify additional suspicious events and follow on activity. Things like remote access, security process termination, unusual PowerShell, newly loaded drivers, or communication with unknown web proxies.
Yeah, so essentially, this is a baselining problem at the end of the day, right? It's not a blockchain problem. And the problem though with baselines is they rot. A workstation that had a legitimate reason, say 6 months ago, may not today. So whoever is owning that allow list, or whatever list is being used to help with these baselines, it needs a review cadence, because if not, you're essentially back to this alert fatigue inside the next month, 2 months, 3 months after.
Yeah, exactly. Great point.
All right, John, let's finish the defense section with the blast radius reduction.
Yeah, certainly. And really, this ties back to the third-party risks we've been discussing here. So high-value applications should not have unrestricted access to broader enterprise systems, right? A Windchill server should only reach the databases, directories, storage systems, and management services it generally requires, right? And I know what you're probably thinking. This sounds so trivial. You've definitely heard of the least privilege, right? And you've likely think that you're covered in your organization. But many attacks are successful because of a lingering gap. So, kind of like we've been stating, the key point here is that you need to be regularly hunting and testing for overprivileged and over-resourced gaps to close them before the attacker can find them.
Yeah, and the biggest gaps that we see lingering are in these service and admin accounts used by these applications and third parties. So essentially, organizations should apply the same thinking to its vendors.
Yeah, exactly. So I had called out the thinking behind applications, but they should definitely also be applied to your third parties. You need to ask your critical providers about things like privileged access controls, network segmentation, restoration SLAs, breach notification timelines, incident response retainers, and tabletop exercises. You also want to identify which vendors have access to your identity environment, your critical software, manufacturing systems, or IT management tools. And then from there, test whether a compromised vendor account could reach sensitive internal resources and how quickly your team can detect and contain suspicious activity coming from them.
Yeah, and I think an important question to ask here, right, is will you know about a vendor or supplier compromise even if they don't provide you this information in a timely manner? Are you monitoring news sources in the dark web for mentions of that vendor? And then ultimately, how quickly can you act on those signals when they come in? So let's pull this back and give our listeners here the actions that they can take tomorrow morning. And I'll start for those security leaders that are listening. First, I want to call out, know where your EDR coverage actually ends. Agents quietly fall off systems during updates, new assets get missed in onboarding, and some servers will never enroll to begin with. If an attacker is targeting a host without an EDR, your team loses key early warning signs. Regular automated audits of EDR deployment is the only way to know your true detection posture, but most importantly, to help you close that gap before an attacker finds them first. Second, treat your critical vendors and applications as extensions of your ransomware attack surface. Professional service providers, engineering partners, and outsourced IT firms frequently hold trusted access and sensitive data across multiple customers simultaneously. Ask the hard questions about their privileged access controls, network segmentation, and breach notification timelines before an incident forces that conversation. Additionally, monitoring news in the dark web so you can act fast, even if they are too slow to notify you. My morning action for tomorrow, that for those that are listening, pull a current inventory of all assets and cross-reference it against your EDR deployment. Flag any systems in audit mode, servers with active exceptions, or hosts that have dropped off from coverage in the past 30 days. That gap list is where your exposure is starting.
All right, those are some great call outs for the leaders. Now for the operators here, I have a few major takeaways. Number one, review or build detections for your EDRs going dark, right? So Brandon covered the regular audit side for the leadership, but what we're talking about here is those EDR killers when they get disabled. An endpoint that suddenly stops reporting telemetry should be an immediate trigger for your investigation workflows, not just a routine health alert. Make sure your team can quickly investigate through independent network, identity, and host telemetry, and that you have playbooks for the likely next steps in the attack to quickly identify new activity. Number two, baseline and alert on blockchain RPC traffic. Identify which systems in your environment have a legitimate reason to communicate with public blockchain services. And alert when that traffic originates from servers, domain controllers, or non-developer workstations. particularly here when it coincides with things like driver loads, EDR failures, or unusual remote access activity. The goal here is not to block all blockchain traffic indiscriminately. It's to detect it precisely where it is not expected. So my tomorrow morning action for you: review your current alert coverage for security process termination, confirm that an EDR agent failure triggers an investigation workflow, and then check whether your detection platform has a rule watching for outbound connections to Polygon RPC providers from non-developer systems. Overall, in closing, extortion and ransomware numbers keep going up as groups are getting more advanced. Ensure EDR coverage is complete and that you are actively monitoring and managing your third-party risks to stay ahead. That's all for this week. Thanks for listening to another episode of ShadowTalk. If you'd like to read our full report on ransomware and cyber extortion in Q2 2026, it's available in the link tree below. That's all. Thanks for listening to another episode of ShadowTalk. If you'd like to get in touch, please remember we just added our feedback survey to the link tree. It only takes a few minutes, and please let us know how we can improve. We'll be back next week with another episode of ShadowTalk.